As I begin, I want you all to join me in a thought experiment. I want you to think about what home means to you. Is home a place that's literal? Is it a house? Is it a city, a state, a country? Or is it something more figurative, a warm feeling, a loving embrace, the idea that you are welcome? I imagine for maybe all of you, there's a mixture of these phenomena in your brain when you're thinking about what does home mean for you. But home is a little more complicated than that for many people. Think about, for instance, the African American experience. Now, certainly they might think of home in a literal space, a place they grew up, for example. They might think of it as a place of welcoming in the bosom of their mother's arms. But so much of their experience has been about home meaning a place of a second-class education, home being a place of poor access to health care, home being a place where signs on the road say, insert offensive language, go home. This is the cost of the ticket for many African Americans thinking about home in this country. But think about the damage that causes to who you are and your notion of being. Many African Americans, in fact, began to look for home elsewhere. In the wake of the great success of Alex Haley's Roots, people started traveling to Africa to find their home. But it begs the question, can you actually find home in a place you've never been? I wanted to find out the answer to that question, and so I took myself to Ghana, my first time in the African continent, to watch others return home. Now, it's important to know one thing about me. When I think of myself, I don't think of myself as much of a romantic. My home was where I was born and raised. My home is North Carolina and Virginia. So I was confused as I'm flying across the Mediterranean from England and find myself looking at the in-flight monitor and seeing I'm now in African airspace. I was thrilled. And I found myself wondering, am I thrilled because I'm excited about the adventure? Or am I thrilled because somehow, romantically, mystically, I'm being called home? I was unprepared for that emotion. So I stuffed it back into my emotional suitcase, my baggage, and we land in Accra, and I'm getting off the plane watching other people return. And I actually do look over my shoulder, hoping I'm going to see that person bend down and kiss the tarmac in this romantic exaltation that they've returned home to a place they'd never been. No one did that. But I was not going to be deterred. The next day, I found myself on the Trans-West African Highway, heading to Cape Coast and Elmina, two villages on the Ghanaian coast and sites of some of the most impressive slave castles on the Ghanaian coast. There were at one point 80 different castles, now there's 2, and they are tourist sites. When you're driving along the highway and you see these buildings in the distance, you can't help but be struck by their awesome beauty. Not awesome in that fun and silly way, but awesome. They are huge buildings right out on the coast, and when you get to the actual buildings, you see there are cannons all around them. They are painted and whitewashed. They are austere. They are intimidating. They speak of authority. You can study these things and know these things. I certainly did. But then something else happens. You find yourself on a tour group, and you find yourself entering slave dungeons. Now, before these castles became warehouses of human beings, before there were even castles, these were fishing villages for who knows how long. And they became trade centers where cotton and ivory and gold were traded hands. Then the Europeans discovered Cape Coast and Elmina and gave them their names, built these fortresses to warehouse these goods, built these fortresses to warehouse the soldiers who would protect these goods, and then in time built these fortresses to hold human beings because they were worth more than anything else. So you can know these things, and once you enter into the slave dungeon, all of these things disappear. You find yourself in your tour group walking down into the dungeon on a very slick dirt floor. There are a few lights there now, they weren't there before, so you could watch your step. And you're listening to the tour guide telling you stories of what it was like to be brought as an African slave into these warehouses of horror. And then you're showed markings on the floor where people in coffles and chains had scraped marks. And then you actually see on the wall, and it's a little bit hard to make out on this slide, I know, mark on the wall where the floor used to be. In 1974, UNESCO decided to make or preserve these slave castles as World Heritage Sites. They decided to clean up these places. And that mark on the floor, it's about at knee height, like a white chalk mark you can see. That was the floor before they started to excavate. What were they excavating? They were excavating human waste, blood, feces, and in the women's dungeons, menses that had piled up to 2 feet in height over centuries. And then you realize, when you're down in that dungeon, that place that was home for people for months at a time, that smell you sense, that dirt floor you walked down, was the remains of people who might have been your ancestors. That smell, you can't shake that smell. They can't get rid of the smell. It's a smell of misery and horror, and nightmares. So you can imagine you're going on to this whole tour and thinking you knew what you were going to expect, and all of a sudden, all of your preparation melts away and you're faced with these horrible experiences. And then you find yourself back out in a courtyard looking at a building in the middle of the courtyard. And the tour guide tells you that's the chapel. The chapel. This is the place where the garrison troops, they would profess their faith. They had to be saved by God, of course. And then the tour continues. 30 feet to the right of the chapel is a door with a skull and bones above the doorframe. This is the torture chamber, where 30 men and women at a time, people who didn't want to be slaves, were chained together, thrown into a room. And by the way, our tour group is 10 people, and the doors closed for 30 seconds, and it was too much for me to bear. 30 people chained in that room until the last person was dead. They drag the 30 people out and demonstrate what power and authority really looked like. And this was right next to the chapel? You can't process these kinds of emotions. This can't be home. As the tour goes on and you're wondering about all of these different kind of emotions and horror, you find yourself finally at the most famous stop on the tour, the doors of no return. These are the doors through which literally millions of people were passed out to waiting ships, off into the New World, North America, South America, England, for a whole series of other, shall we say, adventures. Well, the tour guide takes you to the doors, tells you this story, and then opens the doors, and you pass through with your tour group. And you are now prepared emotionally for a literal wasteland. The memories of millions of people laid out before you. And what do you find? You find the same fishing village that has been there for hundreds of years, before the Europeans were there, before they built the fortresses, before they discovered the wealth to be found in human trade. At this point, I'm emotionally exhausted. I can't even process looking at these men bringing in their trade. They aren't paying attention to me either. They see these tourist groups come and go all the time. I felt very uncomfortable looking at people living their lives in the shadow of this really monument to horror. And ironically, I was desperate to go back inside. I felt more at home in the slave castle. Later that evening, I was back at the resort hotel a few minutes away, enjoying a dinner, flipping through images that some of which you just seen on my iPhone, and I found myself humming a tune. I think I'm a nice guy. The idea of humming a tune when I'm witnessing all this horror imagining the nightmares that people who might have been my ancestors went through. I stopped. I'm like, what are you doing, Jonathan? What are you actually humming? And then I realized that I was humming along with the musician in the restaurant playing a nice little ditty on a synthesizer. And then when I realized what he was performing, all the emotional confusion I had experienced earlier in the day, the wonderings that I had 3 or 4 days beforehand about, was I really a racial romantic? Was I being called home? It all came to land in this one moment. And I realized that I was humming along, knowing the words, everything I want the world to be is coming true, especially for me. And the reason is clear, it's because you are here. You're the nearest thing to heaven that I've seen. I'm on top of the world looking down on creation, and the only explanation I can find is the love that I found ever since you've been around. Your love's put me at the top of the world. Now, for those of you who are my age, you would know this is the Carpenters, and that this is the height of 1970s pop treacle. Why is this playing here? And then I realized that as much as I was being romantically tugged back home, that these lyrics are saying, you've come back for me. I realized the reason they're playing the song is because I am their tourist target market. They knew I would recognize these lyrics, and they knew it would be appealing to me. The novelist Carol Phillips writes, where a man makes his memories is the place he shall call home. The memories that I witnessed or experienced during this couple days in Elmina and Cape Coast overwhelmed me and left me wondering, really, where was home? I didn't want home to be a horror-soaked dungeon. No one wants that. But I also know I didn't want home to be a place of second-class citizenship, a place of mind your manners, lower your eyes, don't talk back, get off the sidewalk, yes sir, no sir, yes ma'am, no ma'am. A place of denied opportunities. But that was home. Historian in me tells me that was home and remains home for many people. We've been asked here today to solve questions, solve for why. And the fact is, I have more questions in the end than I do answers. And maybe that tells us something about the complications of what home really is. Something we always need to keep figuring out, working towards, and hopefully making it a better place. Thank you.